Yat Ekklesia Church. Good morning. This is Mark Charles. I am so grateful to have an opportunity to be with you this Sunday. It is November 29th, the final Sunday in October, and I'm very honored to be with you today. I'd like to begin just by introducing myself. So Yat Mark Charles Yinashia, Sin Bakedina and Nishlin, Dr. Higlini Bashichin, Sin Bakedina Dashachedo Toluchini Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our four clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsin B'ke Dene'eh. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin B'ke Dene'eh. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toluchitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the lands now known as Washington, D.C., and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor and thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. They are the nation that they lived here, they hunted here, they farmed here, they fished here, they raised their families here, they buried their dead here. They were here long before Columbus got lost at sea, and they are still here. I want to acknowledge them as a nation. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. I also want to acknowledge that you are on the lands of the Tuscarora, where you are watching this sermon in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I want to acknowledge the Tuscarora, excuse me, and I want to thank them for being the indigenous nations, the host people of the lands where I'm speaking to today. We have about 35 to 40 minutes to talk this morning, and I've been given a little bit extra time than your normal sermon, and I'm very grateful for that because I want to talk to you about this holiday that we just finished celebrating. It's called Thanksgiving. And I want to share with you some of my journey that I've come to both as a Christian, as a Native man, and as an American citizen of why I concluded about 2 years ago that I need to decline, excuse me, that I need to decline this opportunity to celebrate Thanksgiving. Our family stopped celebrating Thanksgiving about 2 years ago. And that was a very intentional choice that we made based on what I was learning and based on the research I was doing and based on even my experience as a Navajo man here in the United States of America. And I want to share some of that with you. A lot of the research that we did going into this came from a book I published about a year ago titled Unsettling Truths, the Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. And my co-author and I, Sung-Chan Ra, did a lot of work. We actually met almost a decade ago now, and we're really both focusing on speaking to the church. He was talking a lot about lament, and I was calling the church into a process of lament based on this doctrine of discovery, and we decided to write this book together. And so some of what I'll be talking about actually comes from a lot of the first few chapters of this book, which deals with how the church got from the teachings of Jesus to a dehumanizing doctrine of discovery. And so I want to share some of that with you this morning as I go into this discussion on, I'm calling this sermon about Thanksgiving. And I want to bring you to at least understand why I came to the conclusion that I came to, which was to decline to celebrate the U.S. holiday known as Thanksgiving. To understand this, we have to first take a look at the Doctrine of Discovery, and I want to share some slides with you. So let me go ahead and bring that up on my screen here, and we can go from there. Okay, so to understand what happened with the Doctrine of Discovery and the impact this had on the church, we really have to look back into the history of our nation as well as the history of our church. And I want to take us back not only to the teachings of Jesus, but I'm going to go back prior to that to Old Testament Israel's understanding of land covenant. You see, the God of Abraham created a covenant with Abraham to bring him to some promised lands. And this land covenant set up what I would call a barometer of prosperity for the people of Israel. And the basic tenets of the covenant were if they obeyed God and kept his commands, he would bless them and they would prosper on their lands. And if they disobeyed God, he would exile them and punish them and remove them from their lands. So they had a barometer, more or less, of prosperity to know how they were doing in their relationship with God. If they were healthy, if their borders were strong, if their nation was doing well, they could believe that they were doing well in their relationship with God. If they were exiled from their land, if their crops weren't growing, if their families were hurting, if their borders were weak, they could know that something was amiss or awry in their relationship with God. So this land covenant created a barometer of prosperity. And when Jesus came into this earth, the people of Israel were not prospering. They weren't fully exiled from their lands, but they definitely were not free and sovereign in their own lands. They were under the oppression of the Roman Empire. They were being taxed. They were not free to move about. They were have censuses being taken. They were not free to worship freely all the time. And so they were under the oppression of the Roman government. And the people of Israel, especially the leaders and the religious leaders and even some of the pious citizens, were waiting for God to send his Messiah to restore them back to the greatness of the kingdom of David. The kingdom of David was kind of the golden era of the nation of Israel. Their borders were strong. They were expanding. They had a king whose heart was after God's. He was after God's own heart, and God was blessing them, and they were fruitful as a nation. And they were waiting for this Messiah to come in an imperial and even military way to restore them back, to throw off their Roman oppressors and bring them back to the greatness of this kingdom of David. Now, Jesus knew what he was coming into, I believe. He knew there was going to be this expectation on him to create this military, imperial, earthly empire here on earth while he was with us. And so he did some things to actually change expectations, right? He was the Messiah, and angels announced his birth, but they were singing to shepherds. Yes, he was the Messiah and the Son of God, but he was raised as a refugee in Egypt and grew up in the backwater town of Nazareth. Early in his ministry, when Jesus I want to go back and take us back quickly to this passage in Deuteronomy, which really kind of signifies where the people of Israel were at in their relationship with God and how they used prosperity as their barometer. I want to highlight this passage from Deuteronomy 30. And it says in this passage that the Lord our God may bless us in this land, whether we go in to possess it. But if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we cross over this river to possess it. This was how their relationship with God worked. This is how their land covenant and their barometer of prosperity worked. If they were obedient and blessed by God, they would prosper in their lands. If they were disobedient, they would be exiled by God and removed from their lands. And so the people of Israel were expecting the Messiah to come and return them back to their prosperity in their lands. And as we said, Jesus was changing that expectation. And early in his ministry, Satan came to tempt him, and he took him to the top of a high space, and he showed him the kingdoms of the world because he thought that was the goal. And he said that if Jesus would bow down to him, he would give these kingdoms to him. Well, Jesus looked at Satan, he rebuked him, and then he walked away. Earthly kingdoms were not his goal. At one point, John the Baptist, who was heralding the coming of the Messiah, and he was out baptizing people and preparing them for Jesus. When he was in prison, he heard stories that Jesus was actually healing the children of widows, raising them from the dead, and healing the servants of centurions. This was not the image of an imperial Messiah that John the Baptist was looking for. And so he sent his disciples to ask Jesus and say, hey, are you the one who's coming, or should we expect someone else? I love Jesus' response. He turns around, he heals more sick, he casts out more demons, gives sight to more of the blind, hearing to more of the deaf. And he says to John the Baptist's disciples, go back and tell your teacher what you've seen. Blessed is the man who does not stumble on my account. Jesus basically rebukes John the Baptist and says, this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. Either get on board or get out of the way. In the passage of John, there's this feeding of 5,000 men, probably 15 to 20,000 men, women, and children. Jesus feeds them with a lunch that his disciples took from a small child. And the people are so excited after they see this miracle that they come to make Jesus king by force. But an earthly imperial kingdom was not his goal, and so he walks away. In the middle of the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are with Jesus and he's teaching them. And he says to them, who do the people think I am? Well, some think you're Elijah, they say. Others think you're John the Baptist. Some think that you're one of the Old Testament prophets. He says, well, how about you? Who do you think I am? Peter, who's always the bold one, says, you're the Messiah. Now, Jesus doesn't congratulate him. He doesn't say, great, let's go out and share this with everybody. No, he actually tells the disciples, yes, you're right, but shh, don't say anything. And then he begins to teach them plainly that the Messiah, the Son of Man, must be persecuted and even crucified. This picture of Jesus, the Messiah, being crucified is so contrary to what Peter believes that he takes his teacher aside and begins to rebuke him. And Jesus turns to Peter and he says, get behind me, Satan, because you are not on the side of God, but of men. And not only does Jesus tell him that he will be persecuted, but he goes on and he says in the book of Luke that you, the disciples, will also be persecuted. They will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. You will be brought before kings and governors, all on account of my name. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, sisters, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Everyone, he said, will hate you because of me. This is not this barometer of prosperity that the disciples were used to. This is not what they had signed up for. This is not what they were looking for. And the whole second half of the book of Mark is Jesus trying to convince his disciples that there's a new barometer. In fact, he goes back and even in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, Jesus tells the disciples that they'll be blessed not when they prosper, but when they are persecuted. He's giving them a new barometer, and the disciples do not like this new measure, and they fight against it. Again, Jesus has to rebuke Peter. There's one story in Mark where the disciples, they're out and they see this man healing in the name of Jesus, but he's not with them. He's not a part of their group, and so they told the man to stop. They're pretty proud of themselves, and they come back and tell Jesus what they've done. And Jesus says, surely so some of you will not lose your reward if you give them even a cup of water. He says, don't stop him. But then he goes on and he actually threatens them. He says, if you cause one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it's better if you tied a millstone around your neck and jumped into the ocean. He said, if your eye causes you to believe you're better than someone else, gouge it out. It's better to come into heaven, to come into life with a blind eye than with two eyes to be thrown into hell. He says, if your hand causes you to think you're better than someone else, cut it off. It's better to enter life lame than with two hands to be thrown into hell. Jesus saves his most dire warnings, his most direct threats, not for the Roman oppressors, not for the teachers and the Pharisees and the hypocrites who are leading the people, not even for the tax collectors, the sinners, and the people who are actively disobeying the will of God. No, Jesus saves his most direct threats for his disciples when they begin thinking that because they're with Jesus, they're better than other people. Later, in the book of Mark, Jesus knows he's about to be taken and to be crucified. And he's modeling for his disciples what they need to do. And he goes into the garden and begins to pray. The disciples are with him, but they fall asleep. When the soldiers come, the disciples who have not been preparing themselves, they are not used to this new barometer of persecution, they draw their swords, and Peter actually cuts off one of the servants' ears, we're told in another gospel. Jesus bends down, picks up the ear, heals it, puts it back on the guy, and then he rebukes Peter. And then all the disciples flee. Jesus is standing before Pilate the next day. And Pilate doesn't want to crucify Jesus. He doesn't want to punish him. He wants to set him free. But Jesus isn't answering his question. And he says, don't you know I have the authority to set you free to kill you? Answer my question. Jesus scoffs at him. The only authority you have, he said, comes from my Father in heaven, what he gave you. He said, my kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my servants, the angels, not my disciples who I call friends, would fight to preserve my arrest, to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But no, my kingdom, he said, is from another place. Jesus was adamant all the way to the end. Not only was he bringing a new barometer, but he was not on earth to establish a worldly, earthly, imperial, military empire. And he went on to die. And he died alone. It wasn't until Pentecost that the disciples finally clued in about this new barometer, about the path Christ was leading them down. And beginning with Stephen, they were persecuted and even killed for their faith. And almost all the disciples went on, we're told, to die some type of a martyr's death. So in the first century, when we had the church following Jesus, you became a member of this church through your baptism, your discipleship, your confessions, and your community. And when you joined this church, you knew that you were standing in opposition to empire. You knew that because of your membership in this church, there's a good chance you were going to be persecuted and maybe even killed because of your faith. This goes on through the first, second, and third centuries. In the fourth century, we have a bishop, the bishop of Caesarea, whose name is Eusebius. And Eusebius is writing down a book, and he is recording what he calls the ecclesiastical history, the history of the church. It's a volume, actually, of 11 books. And in this volume, he establishes the divinity of Christ. And he talks at length about the piety and the honor of the martyrs. And he records how, beginning with Stephen and going all the way through the first, second, and third centuries, there are people who are being martyred for their faith, and he holds these people up as pious people who are blessed because they're sharing in the suffering of Christ. Now, all of my life, I have blamed the heresy of Christendom, the heresy of Christian empire, on Constantine. Constantine, right, he converted to Christianity, and he decided to make Rome Christian. He created a Christian empire. And all my life, I've blamed this heresy on Constantine. But as I was studying and preparing for writing our book, as I was studying the writings of Eusebius, I realized that the heresy of Christian empire, the heresy of Christendom, was fed to Constantine by Eusebius. He records later in his writings that during the 4th century, during the Great Persecution, not only did he see and knows, not only did he know some of the people who were martyred personally, because this persecution was happening in Palestine and Caesarea, where he was from, but he said he even saw some of their deaths himself. And the whole last third of his volume of ecclesiastical history is no longer writing about the piety and the blessedness of the martyrs, but he's focusing much more on the emperors. And he begins propping up Constantine, even as a God-ordained emperor of Rome, which is unusual because in his entire book, he's been highlighting that Rome, the empire, has been causing the persecution. And suddenly in book 8, and going into books 9, 10, and 11, we see him holding up the empire and holding up the emperors and Constantine as blessed and people ordained by God to lead this empire. Now, if you're writing a book called Ecclesiastical History, technically your book doesn't have a conclusion, right? Because the history of the church will not end until Christ, the bridegroom of the church, returns. So if you're writing a book about the history of the church, by virtue of the fact that you're writing it, your book should have no conclusion. It's merely a preface, maybe an early chapter in this long saga of this community of believers who are waiting for their bridegroom to return. But if you read all 11 books in the volume of ecclesiastical history, and you get to the last chapter of the final book, the chapter that is titled The Victory of Constantine and the Blessings under him accrued to the whole Roman world, you will learn that Eusebius actually does have a conclusion. He says that at the same time they celebrated and extolled first of all God, the universal king, because thus they were taught. Then they also celebrated the praises of the pious emperor, and with them all his divinely favored children. He goes on to write that the supreme God granted from heaven above the fruits of his piety, the trophies of victory over the wicked and that nefarious tyrant with all his counselors and adherents, he cast prostrate, not at the feet of Christ, but of Constantine. So Eusebius actually does have a conclusion in his book. And it's not about the salvation that comes to Rome through Christ. It's the salvation that comes to Rome through Constantine. Why would he do this? Well, because if you want to create a Christian empire, if you want to have an earthly, imperial, military empire here on earth, your biggest challenge is not the world, it's Christ. Christ was adamantly opposed to the notion of a Christian empire. He was very direct, convinced that his kingdom was not of this earth, it was somewhere else. So if you want to create a heresy known as Christendom, a Christian empire, the first thing you have to do is you have to write Christ out of ecclesiastical history, which is exactly what Eusebius does. He writes Christ out of ecclesiastical history. So in the next century, the 4th century, and the 5th century, the theologians of the church have to decide what they're going to do with this heresy. And one of the major theologians of that time, of that era, was actually Augustine. And Augustine, one of his great works, what he's known for, is his just war theory. Now, if you look at the just war theory really has 2 purposes. The first purpose is to help Christian nations fight wars more justly. The second is to justify how Christian citizens of these Christian nations can go off and kill in the name of God and empire, because a plain text reading of Jesus' teaching doesn't allow that. And so I understand that the fact that we have a just war theory is evidence that Augustine was choosing to collude with Christendom rather than to prophesy to it. But I wanted to find out where he crossed the line, because when you cross the line with Jesus, he tends to get a little pointed with you, right? He called Peter Satan. He still used him as his disciple, but he pointed out where he went amiss, where he crossed the line. And I wanted to know, where did Augustine cross the line? I looked through his writings on just war. I looked through his writings on the 2 kingdoms, and I didn't find it there. But as I was reading through and looking at his writings on the correction of the Donatists, a heretical group that was teaching falsely, I found some very interesting things. In chapter 5, Augustine is wrestling with the question of what is the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire, right? We've never had this before. We've always been an oppressed group of people in a secular empire. Now that we run the empire, what's the role, what's the duty of a Christian king in this Christian empire? It's actually not a bad question. It just has a horrible premise, because the premise accepts the notion that there is such a thing theologically as a Christian empire. And in his writings, Augustine says, how then are kings to serve the Lord with fear? For a man serves God in one way, in that he is a man, in another way that he is also king. In that he serves him as a man, he serves him by giving faithfully, but in that he is also a king, he serves him by enforcing with suitable rigor such laws as ordained what is righteous, and he punishes what is the reverse. He prevents and chastises with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commandments of the Lord. In chapter 6, he goes on, he says it's better that men should be driven to worship of God by teaching than they should be driven to it by fear of punishment or pain. But we found advantage, he said, in first being compelled by fear or pain, so that afterwards they might be influenced by teaching. See, Augustine is saying that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to compel people to worship God, to obey the commands of the church through fear of punishment and pain. This is completely outside the teachings of Jesus. This has nothing to do with how Jesus lived his life or did his ministry. Yet this is how Augustine is coming to the conclusion. He is absolutely crossing the line. And if Jesus did not hesitate to call St. Peter Satan, I'm sure he would not hesitate for a moment to call out St. Augustine and say, what are you thinking? You are not on the side of God, but of men. Get behind me, Satan. So this type of thinking leads on to what we call the Crusades. The Crusades are about expanding the Christian empire as well as protecting Jerusalem. In the 13th century, we have another theologian, Thomas Aquinas, and he's also dealing with heretics. And he is writing at that time, and he is concluding that if the secular authorities have the ability to kill people who break men's laws, how much more authority does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? He writes, it's a much graver matter to corrupt the faith, which quickens the soul, than to forge money, which supports temporal life. He says, so if forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority, how much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but even put to death? So Thomas Aquinas is concluding that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to kill people who don't keep the commands of the church or of Jesus. Also in the 13th century, we have the introduction of this word called the infidel. It's a category of other. It's applied to indigenous peoples, to Moors, or to Muslims, anyone who doesn't worship the God of the white European Christian male. Now that we have this category of other, now we don't even need a just war theory, because now we can base our wars justify our wars on theological grounds. We're fighting the other, we're fighting the enemies of Christ. And so it's out of this that in 1452, Pope Nicholas V writes out these words, and he says, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls, collectively become known as the Doctrine of Discovery. They were written between 1452 and 1493. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe, saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world already inhabited by millions and claim to have discovered it. If you think about it, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, you can even colonize those lands. You cannot discover them unless you believe the people who are there prior are not fully human. This makes the Doctrine of Discovery a systemically white male Christian supremacist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. Now in 1630, the Protestant church didn't fully buy into this doctrine. This was a Catholic doctrine, they didn't fully buy into it. In 1630, John Winthrop was on board a ship in what is now called the Boston Harbor. He was here to plant the Boston colony with other colonists. And he preached a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity. In this sermon, he refers to the colonists that he's with as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he tells his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining their good deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. They should keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. These are just your basic church-going Christian exhortations. However, at the end of the sermon, he's trying to convince his congregants to adhere to his teachings, his exhortations, and he decides to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing at the banks of the Jordan River ready to cross over and take possession of their promised land. And God's reiterating the threats and promises of his land covenant with them. But if our hearts shall turn away, it says, so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river. But in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that to vast sea. Why does he do that? Well, because they didn't cross the river, they crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the teachings of Jesus to be a city on a hill, and based on the model of Old Testament Israel, the colonists, are standing on the shores of their promised lands, ready to go and take possession of them. Now, if we read the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Joshua, we will learn that promised lands have a certain way that you take control of them. In Deuteronomy 20, it says, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. In the books of Deuteronomy and in the books of Joshua, when God gave promised lands to his people, that came with a commandment to literally commit genocide over those lands. Promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. I refer to this sermon as the birth of the myth of American exceptionalism. This idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains, we go past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's a growth in churches, there's a renewal of denominations. Early 1800s, we have this term being coined known as manifest destiny. The belief that this nation of white Europeans has the God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. Now maybe you're thinking, Mr. Charles, we don't think that way anymore. That's old school thinking. Well, think back just a few years, 2015. Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, was here in the United States, and he was lobbying against the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration was negotiating. He was invited to speak to a joint session of Congress, and he was speaking to a very divided, a very partisan Congress, just like the Congress we have today. He had to get everyone on the same page behind him, and so early in his remarks, he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. You see, the United States of America and the modern nation state of Israel have a very dysfunctional and codependent relationship that has nothing to do with freedom, equality, or justice. It's about justifying oppression. We need Old Testament Israel's understanding of promised land to justify what we did to African Americans and Native Americans. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify their ongoing oppression against the Bedouins and the Palestinians. We have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. Has nothing to do with freedom or equality or justice. It's about justifying oppression, and in our case, even genocide. So what does this have to do with Thanksgiving? What does this have to do with what does it mean for us to celebrate this holiday that we have in our country known as Thanksgiving? Well, I want to read to you a piece that I wrote a few years ago. It was 2 years ago. It was as we were finishing up our book. I had done a lot of research on some of the history I just shared with you, and I had looked specifically at the history of one of our presidents, Abraham Lincoln. I want to end my sermon by reading this piece to you that I wrote. It will take about 10 minutes. We will end the sermon, and after the service, we're going to have a Q&A time where we can have some question and answer and discussion of some of the things that I've laid out in this presentation today. I welcome you to listen to this. I'm done. I can no longer in good conscience celebrate the national holiday known as Thanksgiving. Over the past several years, my ability to celebrate this holiday has diminished as I've learned more about the Doctrine of Discovery and the white supremacist, ethnic cleansing, and genocidal history of our nation. But I continue to participate because I told myself, how can you decline an opportunity for Thanksgiving? Excuse me. I knew that the story of Thanksgiving was false. The mythological tale of a cross-cultural potluck between a group of pilgrims and their Indian hosts was merely a story perpetrated to soothe the transgenerational and communal manifestation of a complex perpetration-induced traumatic stress that is easily observed in a vast majority of white Americans. Socrates notes that the doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer. And I like to remind people that you cannot build a nation on 500 years of dehumanizing injustice without traumatizing yourself. But every year, on the fourth Thursday of November, our family continued to gather with friends and neighbors around a turkey. Like most Americans, I had grown up with this tradition, and my wife and I continued it even while we lived on the reservation with our neighbors who were there, as well as after we moved to Washington, D.C. We did this because I continued to tell myself, how can you decline an opportunity for Thanksgiving? But no more. This past year, I have learned too much and put too many pieces of our history together. On October 3, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln gave a proclamation which declared a day of Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November. This is the proclamation that helped establish our current tradition of Thanksgiving. And in his proclamation, he stated that the year that is drawing towards its close has been filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and healthful skies. To these bounties, which are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they came, others have been added, which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart which is habitually insensible to the ever-watchful providence of Almighty God. President Lincoln begins his proclamation with what seems to be on the surface a very standard offering of thanks. This past year has been filled with blessings of the fruitful fields and healthful skies, and he doesn't want to forget the source from which they came. He then goes on to note that others have been added. And this is where his Thanksgiving proclamation becomes problematic. The others that have been added refers to the bounties and fruitful fields. He is referring to lands. Lands have been added. In February of 1863, just 8 months prior to his Thanksgiving proclamation, Abraham Lincoln personally signed a bill which nullified the treaties of the tribes in the state of Minnesota. And in March of that same year, he signed another bill which granted him the authority, without treaty or negotiation, to remove the tribes of Indians from the state of Minnesota. That removal began in April, and the Dakota and Winnebago and other tribes were rounded up, held prisoner at Fort Snelling, which is near modern-day Minneapolis, and then loaded onto barges, ships, trains, and removed to the Crow Creek Reservation, which had been established in the Dakota Territories east of Minnesota. Or west of Minnesota, I'm sorry. The removal itself was inhumane, and Crow Creek was not sustainable for so many people. Both deficiencies resulted in the death of many Dakota and Winnebago people. His proclamation goes on. In the midst of a civil war of unequaled magnitude and severity, which has sometimes seemed to foreign states to invite and to provide their aggression, peace has been preserved with all nations, order has been maintained, and laws have been respected and obeyed, and harmony has prevailed everywhere except in the theater of military conflict, while that theater has been greatly contracted by the advancing armies and navies of the Union. Contrary to Abraham Lincoln's proclamation, in the early 1860s, the Civil War was not the only military conflict that the U.S. was engaged in. In the fall of 1862, there was a brief but bloody war with the Dakota tribe in the state of Minnesota. At the conclusion of this war, half of the Dakota surrendered and turned themselves in, and the other half fled north into what is Canada. Those who surrendered were immediately tried in military tribunals, and 303 of them were condemned to death. But those tribunals were legal shams. As noted by historian Carol Chomsky, the evidence was sparse, the tribunal was biased, the defendants were unrepresented in unfamiliar surroundings, conducted in a foreign language, and authority for convening the tribunal was lacking. More fundamentally, neither the military commission nor the reviewing authorities recognized that they were dealing with the aftermath of a war fought with a sovereign nation, and that the men who surrendered were entitled to treatment in accordance with that status. Outside the military theater of the Civil War, another war was taking place where laws and treaties were not being respected and obeyed, and harmony had not prevailed, unless you call the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the ethnic cleansing of the Dakota and Winnebago from the state of Minnesota harmonious. Both events took place in the year for which Abraham Lincoln was giving thanks. His proclamation goes on, needful diversions of wealth and strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged the borders of our settlements, and the mines as well as well of iron and ore and coal, as of precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. After he completed the ethnic cleansing of the state of Minnesota, President Lincoln turned his sights to the territory of New Mexico. In the fall of 1863, one of his generals, General Carleton, gave this order regarding the Navajo people, my people in the Southwest. Henceforth, he said, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or move. There can be no other talk on the subject. This is from the Book of the Navajo by Raymond Friday Locke, published by Holloway House Publishing in 2001. Beginning in the fall of 1863, and in accordance with the policies of the Lincoln administration, the U.S. Army officer Kit Carson traversed the lands of the Southwest. He burned our homes, slaughtered our livestock, and destroyed our crops. Ultimately, he rounded up 10,000 Navajo men, women, and children who were then forcibly marched to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds died of exposure and starvation along the route, and nearly a quarter of our people died while imprisoned in this death camp. The creation of that camp was personally approved by Abraham Lincoln. Just to be clear, in 1863, the acts did not enlarge the borders of U.S. settlements. The ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies of President Abraham Lincoln did. His proclamation goes on. Population has increased, notwithstanding the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege and the battlefield, and the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God. At the start of the 19th century, the population of the United States was 5.3 million. By the end of the 19th century, the population had ballooned to 76.3 million. Abraham Lincoln was correct, but in all honesty, the population had not only steadily increased, but it was greatly multiplying by a factor of 14. However, that stat only tells half the story, for also in the 19th century, the population of Native peoples in the U.S. plummeted from 600,000 to 237,000. For those who are keeping track, that's a decrease of about 60%. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln established a national day of Thanksgiving. While his own ethnic cleansing policies and wars were contributing to a genocide rate in the 19th century of over 60%. That is not only unconscionable, but akin to as if Adolf Hitler declared a day of national Thanksgiving during the height of the Holocaust. So I'm done. I am no longer interested in reclaiming the U.S. holiday known as Thanksgiving. From here on out, the fourth Thursday in November is set aside as a day of mourning, a day of lament. But I am not mourning the genocide of our Native peoples. I lament that travesty on other days, such as Columbus Day, the 4th of July, Memorial Day, President's Day, and Lincoln's birthday. From now on, in my calendar, the 4th Thursday of November is reserved to mourn the fact that we live in a country that in 1863 established a national day of Thanksgiving for the fruits of a genocide it was actively committing. And that is an opportunity for Thanksgiving that I am both morally and spiritually obligated to decline.